Okay, in this last video, 15.4, we're going to look at pain and sensations. We've looked already at the central nervous system and looked at the spinal cord and the brain, and we'll do a little more with those in class. But we've kind of skipped a step. How does a sensation get started? And is a sensation different than a perception? So let's look at that and then work our way into a discussion of pain, because that's going to be a big part of what you're going to be doing in the medical field. So let's even start there. Before we even discuss this, is there a difference between sensation and perception? And since I gave you those terms, there probably is. Uh, Sensation is to begin a signal. There's going to be the body's ability to turn a stimulus into a signal. That's a sensation. A perception is to be aware of that. And you're not always aware of the sensations in your body. Oh, sure I am, Mr. B. I can give you an example right now, and before I say it, you're not even aware of this. But as soon as I say it, you're going to be aware of this particular, you'll perceive this sensation. Are you ready? Your socks, or your shirt, or your pants, or whatever you're wearing. Now you're suddenly aware of these. Before, your body had sort of tuned them out. It was getting that signal over and over again. It was still sending a signal over and over again as long as your skin was being stimulated by your clothes. It was sending a signal, but you were not perceiving it. You began to ignore that. So there's actually a difference between a sensation and a perception. When we talk about receptors, we're talking about those specialized parts of the body that can turn a stimulus into a nerve signal. They can actually generate a nerve signal. Your spinal cord can't generate a signal. It's only going to be able to transport information to and from. So receptors are special because they can get a signal started. So we can look at receptors in different ways. We can talk about them in terms of where they receive the stimulus. Are they receiving stimuli from inside the body or from outside the body? Or even a little specialized one, the proprioception, which are going to be actually interoreceptors, but these are going to be specialized to receive information about the body itself in terms of a postural position and balance. We can also look at the receptors in terms of the kind of stimuli they receive. Every receptor can't receive every kind of stimulus. A hearing receptor cannot turn light waves into a stimulus. Smell receptors can't hear. So we have to be aware that receptors are specialized to that extent. Mechanoreceptors actually pick up mechanical stimuli. Mechanical as in pressure. Think about what happens in our ears. We perceive sound waves as pressure waves, and those pressure waves are turned into nerve signals that are communicated to the brain, which we turn into a perception of a sound. Photoreceptors in the eye detect light. Thermoreceptors around the body detect temperature. Chemoreceptors around the body are going to be detecting different chemical changes, like we would associate with pH levels, for example, or the osmolality of the blood. Is it becoming too salty or too watery? Nociceptors are receptors that we associate with pain. They detect and communicate pain. Some receptors are going to be classified based on their complexity. We won't get too far into this conversation, but you could even see an example on the screen here. Free nerve endings are going to be relatively simple in their structure versus a taste receptor, which is going to be far more complex. We're not going to delve into the complexity too much. We will talk about this even more on the next slide, which is a classification of general versus special. What do we mean by that? When you think about our senses, they really kind of come into two major categories if we talk about how either localized or diffuse the receptors are. General senses, the receptors are all over the body. So we're talking about touch or pressure or proprioception, temperature, pain. These are going to be all over the body. You're going to have pressure receptors all over. But special senses are only going to have the receptors in certain localized regions, and these are going to be quite specific. So smell, taste, sight, hearing, and balance, all of these receptors are actually in the head, and they're going to be quite specialized. So that's why we call them special senses, because their receptors are only going to be in one place, and they're going to be more specialized than the general type. You also see a classification here of somatic versus visceral, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. But as you see, somatic is going to be concerning the skin, muscles, and joints, where visceral receptors, or visceral senses rather, are going to be the receptors we associate with the internal organs. Okay. So how does a sensation get started? If you think about this, um, when you see something or hear something, what's going on in a receptor to make it do something? Again, let's make sure we're clear on this point that a thermoreceptor, let me get this here, a thermoreceptor can only detect temperature. It can't detect light. It can't detect pressure. It can only detect temperature change. So if, taking that as the example, if you have cold, it actually has the ability to detect coldness, and if you have a strong enough stimulus for cold, or it's a frequent enough stimulus for cold, enough that that receptor fires, it reaches its threshold, it will start a nerve signal that will travel along like you've already seen. A receptor will send that signal to the dendrite of an afferent neuron, which will go through cell body and the axon and will travel to the spinal cord. So a generator or receptor potential is simply means, is the stimulus strong enough or frequent enough to make that receptor fire? And importantly, it's got to be the right type. If my eyes perceive light, my ears don't make any noise. They don't. That stimulus does not make my ears work. Okay, there is a condition where you do have some cross. We won't get into this in any detail, but there's some people who actually do mix up their sensory perceptions, and we'll mention that more in class. Okay, so with that, let's talk about some somatic sensation examples. Let's talk about some of the generalized senses that are around the body, starting with touch. We won't delve into all of these in much detail, but I just want to point out again the dermis, and the dermis has a number of touch receptors. These are generalized, they're not special, they're generalized receptors. Even the free nerve endings that we associate with the superior part or the superficial part of the dermis. We have the hair follicle receptors that wrap around the hair follicles. If a hair follicle gets moved or bumped, it can actually vibrate those and send a signal. The Ruffini end organs, they can detect more continual pressure. Here at the very bottom, the Pacini corpuscles detect deep pressure. Let me see if I can get you to see this. Um, if you have deep pressure, these are kind of onion shaped. If you push and squeeze on the skin, you compress that down. You compress that down, and it actually causes a receptor potential to be started. So again, these are just examples of some generalized a generalized sense touch. Some other ones that we can detect somatically, thermal, pain, and proprioception. The one I'll focus on here for a second is pain. If you have a cell or cells that get damaged, they release a bunch of chemicals. And I have here this term inflammatory soup. But the chemicals that get released from damaged cells may stimulate histamines to be produced. They may stimulate prostaglandins. They may stimulate potassium. And these may not mean a lot to you, but these will all stimulate nociceptors for your body to perceive pain. So if you think about what pain is, it is a perception of damage, a perception of bad homeostasis, if you will. So if cells get damaged, they release chemicals. The chemicals irritate nearby nociceptors. The nociceptors send a signal to the brain. There's a problem. Okay. And while we're talking about pain, let's look at the two types of pain, in particular, somatic pain and visceral pain. And you've probably experienced both of these enough to, when I describe them, you'll be able to tell the difference. Somatic pain is the pain that we associate, again, from our skin and our muscles and our joints. And that pain can be superficial. That is, it can be a sharp pain. It may not last very long, but you stab your skin with something and you feel this very quick, sharp pain that travels to your spinal cord and brain, and you perceive that as a very sharp, immediate pain. Deep pain is pain that we associate, or we can describe more as a um, slower aching pain. If you have some achy muscles, for example, the pain is not going to be as immediate. It's not going to be as sharp. It's going to be more diffuse. You're like, my arm hurts. You don't go, my arm hurts right there. You may say, my arm hurts in here. So that's going to be a different kind of pain than superficial somatic pain. Visceral pain is even a little different in that visceral pain is going to be the pain that we associate with thorax and abdominal receptors. In their thorax and abdominal cavities, you'll have these receptors that will communicate pain to the spinal cord and brain, and it's a dull ache, vague pain. You have a very difficult time maybe pointing to it. Think about if you have a gastrointestinal illness and your whole quote unquote tummy hurts, you have a difficult time pointing exactly at where the pain is because it's kind of spread out over a larger area. There's actually sort of a really neat and weird thing that goes along with visceral pain called referred pain, because the thorax and abdominal receptors share the same spinal nerves as some of our somatic afferent receptors. It can kind of confuse the body in terms of where the pain is coming from. The classic example of this that everybody has heard is if somebody's having a heart attack, one of the symptoms of that is that the person will complain of pain shooting down their left arm. And that might seem odd as to why someone who was having a heart attack would have left arm pain. But if you notice here, the receptors, or the nerve signals rather, that communicate cutaneous nerve signals to the brain from the left arm are also going to be shared by those visceral receptors that communicate information about the heart and thoracic regions. So you can have somebody with a heart attack or heart pain with pain down their left arm. You also can see here, and this one's kind of strange, someone can have pain in their right shoulder and it's actually a gallbladder issue. Someone could have an issue with their kidneys, and this pain may be very diffuse. The kidneys are going to be right here, but we'll perceive the pain in a different place. So the moral of the story here is if somebody says, I'm having pain in a certain region, if it's a visceral, aching, deep pain, it may be a referred pain, and where they're pointing is not where someone is actually having the origin of that pain. Again, one more example. If you look here, someone who's having lung or diaphragm pain may perceive that pain up near their throat. So it's sort of an odd feature of visceral pain. A little more pain and then we'll wrap up here. When you hear terms like pain threshold and pain tolerance, they may sound sort of similar. They actually are different. We all of us have a very similar pain threshold. Pain threshold is the point at which our nociceptors send a signal saying, that's wrong, that hurts, ouchie. So we all, well, for example, at 45 degrees Celsius, when you get hot water, we all perceive that signal, we all sense that signal rather, when we have hot water. Now, your pain tolerance, though, can vary. You may not be able to handle pain because you might be a wimp. It might be for cultural reasons, it might be for other reasons, but your pain tolerance may be low. Your pain threshold is the same as the toughest guy or the toughest gal in the room. So pain threshold is the perception of pain. Pain tolerance is how well you can handle it when you've perceived it. Okay, the idea of chronic pain is sort of an odd category as well, because pain actually is helpful. If you sprain your ankle, you want pain communicated to your brain telling you to stop using that ankle. But chronic pain, when you have pain that is always there, that's not helpful, and that can even be debilitating. As you see here, more than 2 million Americans actually suffer chronic pain and ongoing pain, usually visceral in nature. It can be somatic, but this can actually lead to depression. You actually can have a lot of people who have chronic pain have depressive episodes from that because they're never feeling better. And if they're depressed, that might lead to other issues related to drug abuse, trying to handle either the pain or the depression from that pain. Excuse me. Let me also mention here phantom pain, because this is something that you may run into if you work with anybody who's an amputee. Um, Someone can have a limb amputated, and yet the brain is still registering a signal as if the person still has that limb. In this case, a person, the amputee may say, "My right foot itches," and you look down and you want to say you don't have a right foot because they don't, and therefore it can't be itching. But it doesn't mean that the body is not perceiving some kind of signal. And this actually has been difficult for doctors to handle, because how do you treat this if the part that they're complaining hurts isn't there? They found some modifications in surgery actually do help. If they try to block the spinal cord signals as they cut that limb, then that tends to not the body does not then generate as many phantom pain signals. But in general, phantom pain means to communicate a pain from a part that isn't there. And it's hard to give them medication because the pain isn't being generated. It's the brain's perception that there should be something there, and it substitutes pain in its place. So phantom pain is sort of tricky to deal with, but there's surgical improvements have made it a little better and led to fewer incidents of phantom pain. Okay. Last couple slides here. How do we get relief from pain? And this goes back again to a discussion of drugs and how drugs work. Some drugs actually are going to block the pain signal. That is, if you can't get a signal communicated, if you block the nociceptors, then your body doesn't know that you actually are experiencing damage or pain at that site. Some drugs are going to affect our perception of pain. So you can take a drug to where it's not actually affecting, let's say you have a broken arm. It's not affecting the pain signals in the broken arm, but it's affecting your perception of pain by the time it gets to your brain. Local anesthetics, of course, are useful because they can usually work on those sodium channels to where you can't start a signal. Even if the receptor potential is started, it can't travel along the nerve. And general anesthesia is going to affect, again, we talked about the RAS, the reticular activating system. It's going to affect the body's overall systematic sense of pain, and that's why it's very effective. If you can shut down the whole system, then you can do surgery on somebody and they don't perceive any pain from that. The gate control theory of pain, I just want to mention briefly. It's the idea that you can only receive so many signals at one time before the brain can't understand or can't filter out exactly the pain signal. And here's an example. If, let's say, you bump your knee on a table and you start rubbing your knee, then that feels better, right? Well, why does it feel better? It could be by rubbing the knee, you are stimulating a lot of receptors, and you kind of overwhelm the brain's ability temporarily to understand it's getting pain signals. So that's the gate control theory. There's only so many signals that can travel through that gate, and therefore that can actually be a relief if you rub a part that gets hurt. The body does produce opiates, its own endorphins. We have natural pain hormones that we can release in certain circumstances, but usually you have to be, the marathon runner running 20 miles before the body starts to flood with endorphins. It's not something you're going to get from a 5-minute jog. And finally, I just want to mention one special kind of pain, the itch. People usually ask me about this, And it's sort of a unique kind of pain because its mechanisms are a little bit different. We can look at itches as contact itches. That is, there's something that's physically contacting the skin. You know, an insect is on it, or there's chemicals, or there's clothing on it. And if you scratch, you remove that irritant and the pain goes away. You could have an invasive itch where the pain is actually caused by something that's injected an irritant into the skin and your body's making histamine. Histamine is part of an immune response that you're probably aware of if you have allergies, but the scratching may help you remove the outer skin cells along with those agents, and it will make you aware that if you are allergic to something or you need to not, if if you have an insect bite, you scratch that and that feels better because you're actually getting rid of the histamine at that site. As I have here, it's imperfect, of course, because if you scratch excessively, you can cause breaks in the skin, which of course is going to increase your risk of infection. And another thing about itching is it can be psychosomatic. If you see me scratching my hand here, it might make you feel all of a sudden like you need to scratch something. There is that perception if somebody else is scratching, like when someone else yawns, that you need to scratch or you need to yawn. And we're not exactly sure why that occurs, but you can have an itch generated without any sort of irritant or any sort of agent on the skin at all. Okay, so when you look at these videos, we looked at going back to the parts of the brain. We considered the brainstem, diencephalon, cerebellum, cerebrum. We looked at events like epilepsy, concussions, brain trauma, and finished with sensations. We have a lot to look at in this video series, so do go back and look at it if you get a chance. There are a couple of masterings and a PCA for you, and that's going to do it. Thank you very much.